Welcome back. And thank you all for being here. I am excited to speak to Jean Case, who is an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and of course now the best-selling author of Be Fearless. She's also a friend to many, not just to me. She was born right here in Illinois, and we're going to talk about Normal, Illinois, which has so many entendres we can touch on with that title of the town. And she was the youngest child of a single mom. We'll talk about that. Then her family moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And she grew up basically in Florida. After college, she went to law school. She considered heading into politics, but became intrigued by this strange new communication service called the internet. She took a job as director of strategic marketing at The Source, which started as a dial-in bulletin board and was later bought by CompuServe. Does anyone remember CompuServe? Jean moved on to a similar position at GE. Now, at the time, everyone wanted to work at GE, but Jean was a risk taker, which we're also going to talk about. And when she got an offer to join a startup, she jumped at the chance to join America Online. She started as director of marketing and rose to vice president of corporate communications at what became AOL. Does anyone remember AOL? Steve does. Of course we all do. While Jean was at the company, AOL became a household utility that changed forever the way that we communicate. And not only did Jean join AOL and change our lives, it also changed her life. She met her husband, Steve Case, there. And in 1997, the two co-founded the Case Foundation, where she is currently CEO. The Case Foundation operates at the intersection of business and community. Jean believes the tech community should be committed to ethical policies and practices that serve humanity. I'm very interested in asking her about that and today. As Jean has said, people everywhere have great ideas about how to make the world a better place. The problem is, too often, these ideas remain ideas. The Case Foundation is dedicated to turning creative notions into actions. One of the foundation's stated goals is to level the playing field for all entrepreneurs, especially women and people of color. Jean and Steve are also devoted to seeking out untapped talent. They travel around the US in an RV that they own, and she drives. That one we're also going to talk about. I would not be able to do that. This allows them to get away from what Jean calls, which is a fantastic concept, the bubble of belief. They've traveled extensively outside of this country too, which brings me to another one of Jean's passions. Jean is also chairman of the National Geographic Society. She is the first female chair in the organization's 130-year history. That took a while. Jean tells a wonderful story in the book about the importance of staying relevant through innovation. It turns out that back when color photography was a new technology, the publisher of National Geographic decided the magazine could include photographs in each issue. In response, some of the board members resigned. They thought that technology was just a fad. Instead, color photography became one of the magazine's signature features, as we know. Under Jean, National Geographic continues to embrace new technologies. In fact, on Instagram, @NatGeo is the 14th most followed account. They have over 100 million followers. I have so many questions for Jean about the foundation and the society, as well as her book. So please join me in welcoming my friend, Jean Case. I want to start at the beginning because I think your own personal story, even though I know the book was not intended to be a biography, but biography comes out in the pages. Your own personal story, for me, is so compelling and something that I understand in lots and lots of ways. So take us to Normal, Illinois, where you were born.
Sure. Well, let me just say, I consider myself very fortunate to have Mellody Hobson as a dear friend. It was last summer when she learned I had a book coming out, and she said, gee, I'd love to see if you could maybe come to the Economic Club in Chicago. Friends like that we all need, so here I am. And I've really been looking forward to this day. So yeah, my upbringing, it's so funny because this book tour is taking us everywhere. And I often sort of start with saying, yes, I was born in a town called Normal. And then I wait and people laugh because they can't imagine there's actually a town in this land called Normal. But here in Chicago, not only do I know some of you know it, I've talked to some of you who actually went to school at Illinois State or had ties to the community. But to me, it was truly an idyllic place to start out life. I say in the book that it was a place where everybody knows your name. But its very sort of name has everything in the world to do with the book itself. Mellody touched on this, but when I talk about being from Normal, when I talk about being the youngest of four, being raised by a single mom, and we stayed in Normal till I was 11, and then we moved to Florida. That was a very early sort of peek into the real mission of the book. The book was written to make it clear that it's ordinary people who do extraordinary things. And my unusual sort of journey through life, whether it was in tech or whether it's the Case Foundation or National Geographic, I've had this privilege of not just traveling around the United States, but literally around the world, including to some of the most remote places in the world. And what I see everywhere is people have great ideas. They have ideas about how to make the world a better place. But they're often stopped with this idea that it can't be me. I don't have what it takes. And so we kind of wanted to go to school on that a little bit. So about 6 years ago, the Case Foundation commissioned some research looking at the core qualities of change makers, innovators, and entrepreneurs who had broken through in a meaningful way. And what we found were these 5 principles, which are the basis for the book. But more importantly, what we found was we could debunk the myth that people get caught up in, and you need to be a special genius, you had to graduate from the right school, everyone's idea of you have to have these conditions in order to be successful. And so the book is a storytelling book to bring the principles to life, to basically make it clear that these are people like myself, starting out in Normal as the youngest kid of 4 being raised by a single mom. No one would have looked at my life and ever imagined that I would have the opportunities or later a privilege to have in life. And it turns out that's true of people everywhere.
So can you go back a little bit more and unpack that childhood for us? Because there are some moments of great, I think, inspiration that one can glean from your mother, your grandparents.
Yes.
So you're in Normal, Illinois, your grandparents run a hotel.
That's right.
They sit you at the counter to use you as a shill to sell candy.
They do.
Right?
So my grandparents actually settled in Chicago when they came here from Germany. And on my father's side, there were 5 generations here in Chicago, all in the South Side. But my grandparents bought a hotel in the middle of the state in Bloomington, which was a twin city to Normal. And then my mom and my dad followed with us kids. I was the first one not born in Chicago. I was born in Bloomington. So yeah, I used to work in this hotel as a kid. They would, have us do certain things, but my grandmother did notice that when I was behind the counter, people bought more things. She had this counter, and so she didn't mind having the kid next to her. And for me, they were entrepreneurs. They first had a curtain cleaning business here in Chicago before they went to the middle of the state and bought this hotel. But, my dad was a long-haul trucker. My mom was a waitress. So going into this entrepreneurial environment, this hotel, it was the first time I sort of saw commerce in front of me, right? I mean, it was a business that they were running. And then later, when we moved to Fort Lauderdale, I had the rare privilege of receiving an internship by the town's mayor. He had been judge and he was mayor. And that was the first time walking into those law offices where I saw people working in suits. Coming from the working class family that I came from, I just hadn't been exposed to what a professional law office would look like. And I was so grateful for his mentoring of me. Some of you know him. I know Scott Smith is somewhere. His name was Clay Shaw, and he was really a celebrated mayor of Fort Lauderdale, and then he went on to be congressman. But to me, it was kind of life-changing. And, Mellody, I do tell this story in the book. So when we got to Florida, I had such a great public school education in Illinois. At the time, the schools were just so strong that when I got to Florida, I was testing way ahead of my grade level because Florida was at the bottom, okay? They don't have a state income tax. That always hurt education. There was a transient environment, didn't help on the education front. So I get down there and it's terrible. And we realize public school is not really, where I'm gonna go. So my mom, becomes this tireless advocate to get me into a private school. And school was just starting up, and they took me on as a scholarship kid. So I had this weird situation of going from this working class neighborhood that we lived in, that I loved, into this, prestigious, elite, kind of high profile and high net worth daytime families, and when I'd spend nights at friends or whatever. But there again, the same thing I said about normal. No matter where I would go, whether it was in these privileged homes or back in my working class neighborhood, people everywhere had great ideas, a strong work ethic, a real desire to do something. The only difference was opportunity.
Can I stay with this just for one last question before we move on? So your mom wakes up one day and basically says, we're leaving normal.
She does.
Why?
She felt that at the time in that small town, I'm sure it was much more complicated, right? She had just gone through a divorce. So I'm sure there was a whole nother narrative that I, as a kid, wasn't really brought in on about why she might have wanted to leave the town. But her stated reason, she waited till my oldest brother graduated from high school, was she believed there wasn't enough opportunity for us and that we would have to go somewhere else to find more opportunity. What she had seen in the town, which was quite common in those days, was particularly young girls would get married very early and then they wouldn't really pursue careers or whatever. That was sort of almost the culture in the town, and she really had big dreams. And the first principle in the book is make a big bet. And what I later realized was I was my mom's big bet. She had big dreams for her daughter, and she told me every day, you can make a big difference in this world, you can do whatever you set out to do. And I think the move was really on her part, trying to enable that.
Did your mother make you fearless?
Well, I should say, although the book is called Be Fearless, it's really important to start out with a clear understanding that fearlessness is not the lack of fear, right? It's the ability to see that fear, stare it right in the eye, and push past it. So yes, my mother modeled that for me. Look, like everyone else, I struggle with that still routinely, but I am so grateful to have seen not only her, but my German immigrant grandparents who had such an influence in my life, what they overcame and what they achieved. They were civic leaders, in their town. What they achieved in their lifetime, what my mom would push past as challenges every day, definitely modeled for me a certain belief that, no matter your challenges, you can get there from here.
Give us an example of today, something that you struggle with that you feel fear around.
Sure, being on this book tour. So together with my team, we've laughed a lot. They're like, okay, the book is called Be Fearless, Jean. I am a fearless and fierce champion for things I believe in and for people that I back. Not so much when it comes about talking about my stuff. It's true. And so I've had to sort of get into a rhythm.
Do you feel fear around it, or you just don't want to do it?
I would say, there's this sort of fine line between fear and insecurity. But I would say I have felt both. Mainly to sell a book, you have to say the same things over and over again. You have to constantly talk about your book. And for me, how I've gotten through that is this book is a mission book. It's a clarion call to anyone with an idea out there or someone who's already on the journey of taking some great idea forward to get in the game, right? I say we need all the ideas and all the players on the field. We're at a 30-year low of startups in the nation, and I care deeply about the message that it can be you, it can be you, it can be you. And I mean that, and I use research to back it and inspiring stories. So that helps push me past what probably is a little bit of fear in talking about my own thing.
So what are you hoping that people will read the book and do?
So, I think everyone seeks to live extraordinary lives. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say if you're in this room, you already are. But even you, no matter your perch, and what's been clear since we started on the tour, but frankly clear for the 6 years we've been sharing the principles, is that there is a message there for anyone, no matter where they are in the journey of life. So it was originally written for government, for nonprofits, and for principals. Not the book, but the work we did around Be Fearless for these last 6 years. But when we got started, we could see very clearly, I spent time with corporate boards, I spent time with CEOs, I spent time with nonprofits, I spent time with women's groups, you name it, that these principles resonated very deeply. And it shouldn't surprise us, because time and time again, in the research, we looked around, we looked cross-sector, we looked cross-geography. These 5 principles were present wherever transformational change has taken place. And you hope you never stop wanting to get to that next thing in life. And it turns out most people do have some idea. If they're running a big company, I had a guy running a huge firm you guys would know in New York. I'm not going to out him right here. But he wrote me, I gave him an early manuscript, and he wrote me and he said, I had no idea I was so caught up in avoiding risk until I read the book and began to really take stock. I'm going to go do some things that I frankly have been afraid to do. So I didn't expect that, but that's the kind of stuff that we're hearing.
So let's go to the principles.
Sure.
Let's lay out each one.
Okay.
And let's start with the risk-taking, because you said risk-taking is not just willy-nilly.
It's not jumping off a cliff, right?
So,
right, hopefully. So the first one is make a big bet that I talked about. And
did you feel, for example, let me just ask you
Sure.
to make this more personal. Did AOL feel like a big bet when you were leaving GE?
Oh my gosh. Not only a big bet, but
Cliff?
a big risk. And so I was in this job at GE. I was on a very, very good trajectory. I was in my 20s. I had been tapped for their world-renowned management program. At the time, GE, as you said, was the most valuable company in the world. So in some ways you go like, yeah, okay. But I had gone there to create an online service for them. We all saw that there could be a revolution. I believed in the mission of democratizing access to ideas and information and communication. I wanted to spend my time in life empowering others, especially based on my background. I just knew GE was unwilling, I could already see it, to take the kind of risks it would take to break through.
How did you know?
Well, I mean, we would, for instance, go and present at headquarters, and they would say, well, you have to live on an expense to revenue model. And we said, we're our startup within GE. We have no revenue. Like, how do we do that exactly? This idea that you have to live with investment before there's a return just wasn't really selling well at headquarters. They wanted to be in this place, but they didn't want to take the risks necessary. They were 1 and 2 in their markets everywhere they were, and they didn't want to suddenly take a bet on an unsure thing, even though they had an idea that they wanted to do that. So when the startup called that was going to be AOL, I could see risk-taking was in the DNA. And I knew if this internet revolution was going to become real, it would take some serious risk-taking. But here's the thing. When I made the decision to leap, people around me were shrill, Mellody. I mean shrill. Like, you are crazy. No one's ever heard of this thing. It's like, who are they anyway? And, how do you know this is going to be successful, et cetera? And the bottom line was, I couldn't say for certain that it would be successful, but I could say, oddly, that I could see some of those principles that are in the book present at a startup that just weren't at a big company. And so I, of course, jumped over. I think it turned out pretty well. I never looked back. At the height of AOL, we carried 50% of the nation's internet traffic, and I do believe we contributed broadly to the internet revolution. And so I'm so happy I took that risk. But don't get me wrong, it was not easy, and I had to tune out a lot of voices.
So my favorite of the 5, and you say they may not be relevant for everyone.
Not all 5 need to be present. They're not, in a sequence.
Right. So my favorite was make failure matter. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah.
And how you interview people and ask about?
Yeah, that failure thing, it's a big deal. And I don't know, where you sit in terms of your day-to-day living, your professional career, but the bottom line is that, we just talked about risk-taking, and in science and in medicine and technology, we understand R&D, the concept of R&D, which is trial and error, right? But somehow in other modes, it's almost like, yeah, we're going to try to do something new and bold, and we just expect 1,000% of it to work just fine. Thank you very much. It doesn't work that way. When you're taking risks and you're trying new things, you will have failures along the way. Make failure matter is not a celebration of failure, but rather a recognition that failure teaches. And just like in R&D, it's actually the errors that play the most significant role in helping you perfect an idea, groom it, turn left if you have to, try a different way forward. But too often in both corporate cultures, in firms, in life, it's almost like we don't talk about failures, we just don't talk about that here. So there are sort of two chapters that I think really draw this out. And one is, we know this term crash and burn. And what if we called that crash and learn? What if we said this is the moment when we actually probably can learn some really significant things? That's only going to happen by being transparent about the failure and doing the hard work of saying, what have we learned here now and how do we apply it? The second one is fail in the footsteps of giants. Because one of the things that drives me crazy is we sanitize success stories. I mean, we really do, and you probably feel this too if you're out there and someone's introducing you. It all sounds so perfect, doesn't it? So when that happens to me, I teach a lot of MBA classes, and if I'm in front of students, what I try to make sure to do is read a failure resume. I did a whole commencement address on this, which is to say all of the great opportunities for me came out of failure. They just did. But nobody likes to talk about the failure. So you've got a young generation, and sometimes not even a young generation. You've got teams, and they think, well, that person's never failed. So then when they hit their failure, they think it's curtains. It's like we really do owe it, I think, to one another to be more transparent when we hit failure. And I just want to say one thing. There's a difference between screwing up and failure. Right. Screwing up is like, you just didn't bring it. You didn't do what you should have done. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a diligent effort, to apply to, some breakthrough, some new thing your firm are trying to do. And you did everything you should do, but you learned along the way that path wasn't successful. So I just want to make that clear.
So can you also tell us about the bubble of belief, which I love, and that takes us to the RV trip, which I think is so fascinating.
Your mind is blown by the RV thing. Come on, Mellody.
You in behind the big wheel is
Well, my husband, Steve, is here with me, and I must say, we share the driving, and he probably does more than I do, would be fair to say. So yeah, we would say, I don't want to speak for him, but we've talked about it, these trips that we do out into places where we are certain people are different than we are become, I think, for both of us, the highlight of what we do all year. And we get to do some pretty special things out there.
How long do you stay?
Usually about 2 weeks, although this summer we're going to go entirely across the United States. So that'll be a little bit longer. We've done it two ways. We have an Airstream, which is that silver bullet, if you guys remember it, that we love. And we have an SUV that we pull it with. But this summer, to go across the country, we'll actually do like a 27-foot motorhome where it's all one thing attached, because that's just a little easier to travel that many miles.
And so you stay at the camps?
Oh,
you
totally,
do all the...
totally. And we were talking earlier, you might think, oh, do they set up the... No, it's Steve, it's me. When our kids went to college, we started doing this. It's a very intimate time. We love it. We, make our campfire dinners. We just really think it's great. But actually what we love the most, and Steve does this with something that's called Rise of the Rest, where he's basically taking a bus 1 week at a time into communities through our nation's heartland for the most part and beyond to unexpected communities. And he brings press and he brings investors with him to highlight and to spotlight the talent that we see across the country. But in this case, this is the two of us, and we love to go into community. And what we find is that, look, we're all in a bubble, even if we don't intentionally, even if we're not intentionally in that bubble. It turns out if we're not intentional about having people around us who are different with different perspectives and different ideas, that's kind of then we will get in this bubble and our own perspectives will be limited. We're in a very divided time. People are gripped with fear and discontentment. One way out of it is to go spend time with people who are quite different. And I must say, the reach beyond your bubble principle, which you're on, Mellody, the research is overwhelming, both our research and then current research, that it actually is diverse teams that have led to breakthroughs. You hear diversity and you might go, oh, that's a social justice thing. What does that have to do with business? Well, I'm here to tell you it has everything to do with business. The more and different perspectives you have around a challenge or an opportunity, Isn't it like duh that of course that would be better? And now we have research from McKinsey, from Boston Consulting Group, from Deloitte that say diverse teams outperform.
So you call this inclusive entrepreneurship.
I do.
You are pursuing it aggressively.
Yes.
You have gender and race.
And place.
And place, geography as well. Why don't other people have this sense of urgency? You give the stats, 90% of VC money went to men, 1% went to startups with an African-American founder, and I guess that other 9% went to women.
It's more dire than that, because 10% of the deals went to women, 2.2% of the capital went to women. It's more dire than that. So why aren't people bringing a sense of urgency? So we're doing this across the nation. I don't want to overplay it. It's going to be like 3 or 4 cities where we're sitting down in investor roundtables and really trying to understand, what are the barriers? The data is very clear out there. When I say outperform, I don't just mean financially. They're generally more innovative. Like all the things you'd really sort of hope for if you're an investor. So we had an investor gathering in Cleveland. And we went around the table and asked, how do you look at, we put the data out there, how are you looking at this? What are you thinking about as an investor? And I was so happy, 2 investors just came totally clean. It's like, I know the data, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I said, have you ever hired McKinsey? Oh, yeah. But you just don't believe this data. Right. And I'm not kidding, it's a thing out there. However, the good news is, after spending a full day, we brought sort of some case studies in. And I said the book is a storytelling book. Data doesn't change hearts and minds. Stories do. And so, throughout the day, we had some storytelling around what we're seeing, what the opportunities are that we're seeing. We had some inclusive entrepreneurs come in. And at the end of the day, those 2 were totally sold.
So what I'm challenged by, you talk about this, there's never been a more right time for innovation in the world, you talk about.
Never
Including
easier
in America,
than now.
We see this innovation, particularly in Silicon Valley. You say that data doesn't change outcomes, it's hearts and minds, but it's a data-driven endeavor in Silicon Valley. So I don't understand how it'll change.
Well, for instance, in the top 100 firms, 94% of the partners that make the investing decisions are white men. And so, again, remember I said about the bubble, it doesn't have to be intentional. It rarely is intentional that you're crowding out people. What is much more common is you use your network. I use my network, you use your network. And unless we are saying we have to get a little uncomfortable and find people who aren't like us and have some people on our team that can help expand. So I'll give you an example. I have found that if you just literally, there's this sort of movement that's starting called Just Add One. As a woman on boards, it's amazing to me the visibility I have of other talented women that perhaps men don't have, because they just don't have those same networks. And so it's actually not as hard and not to crack. It's just putting the issue on the table and being diligent.
That, but is there that sense of urgency? You have a sense of urgency about it. You have a lens through which you see the inequity, you see the lack of inclusion, you see the opportunity, you understand the data, you accept it.
Right.
So if that lack of urgency is not there, how do you actually move the needle
Well,
I'll tell you 94%?
I'll tell you how this needle is going to move, and it's already started. And I like to say that we're trying to accelerate efforts here, but the bottom line is the train has already left the station, and here's why. The millennial generation and women see the world very differently. They see capital very differently. Last time I was here in Chicago in this building, I was speaking at an impact investing forum. And those 2 segments of society have been extremely conscious consumers. They look at the behavior of companies and brands they buy from. They don't boycott, they boycott, they prefer them, right? And now, as they're coming into more and more capital and wealth, they're applying the same idea, which is capital is a tool. It can be used for so much more than simply a financial return. Impact investing has the financial return, but it brings with it a social impact return as well. And Mellody, you've been engaged in this. And so, I think inclusive is the same thing. I think that we have the way it's been, and then we have a future that's going to go forward. listen, this next generation of wealth will transfer to women and millennials for the most part in an unprecedented way. And I do want to remind you, the oldest millennial is coming up on 40. So it's easy to think about a millennial as like some college kid or whatever. They have growing wealth and capital at their ability. And, I was teaching at Yale School of Management, and this, kid in the back was all shy and didn't want to ask questions, was kind of doing this. And I called out him and he said, well, I just never understood why he would just settle for a financial return. And it's a whole different lens on how we use capital. And
okay, I'm going to stop, but there's a bunch of millennials starting startups in Silicon Valley, or 40-year-olds who have very successful ones. And that millennial lens doesn't bring that diversity inside of those organizations in terms of the people who work there.
No question. And I do believe Silicon Valley is a bubble. And to a certain extent, venture capital is a bubble. And this is what we're hoping to slowly but surely change out there. And maybe not so slowly.
Well, with you doing it, that'll make a difference.
Thank you.
It's just how do you scale that good?
We can't do it alone, though. I mean, we have partnerships everywhere. And as I said, it might be a little bit of pick and shovel work, but then when you sit around an investor group like we did in Cleveland and see how people move their mindset in one day, it's encouraging. It's really kind of putting the issue on the table. And to counter the people who said we just don't believe the data, I've had more people say, oh my God, I had no idea. What can I do?
I want to do one more question before I go to the audience, which is about shifting mindset and your work at Nat Geo. I mean, you've done some really innovative things there, and one was to more or less break up National Geographic into a for-profit business that allows the nonprofit piece of it to exist.
Right.
Can you explain how bold that decision was and how hard
Yeah, I
it
would
was?
say it's both bold and consistent with our history. So, in the early days when National Geographic was founded, it was about science and exploration. We had 33 founders bring it together. And the idea was that the scientific journal would be sold, and that creates all the funding for more science and exploration, cool stuff, right? So then what happens? The next wave, fast forward many, many, many decades, the next wave of new media at that time is cable television. And it's like, crud, cable television is going to put the magazine out of business. We got to do something. So that was really the beginning of this. We did a joint venture with Fox to deliver the National Geographic cable channels. And it was a highly successful partnership that we had. And so you're right, Mellody. 3.5 years ago, what we did, Fox came to us and said, we'd love to expand the venture. Are you guys open to that? So we put all of our commercial businesses into the venture. It's called National Geographic Partners. For us, it created a $1.2 billion endowment and $100 million a year that comes over the transom from that business to fund our work. If you come on the National Geographic campus, and it is a campus, we have just somewhere between 1,000, 1,100 teams there, or people and teams there. Working side by side. You wouldn't necessarily know, are you the society or are you partners? And it's something that we've crafted very carefully. We're super excited. And by the way, if I can just put in a plug, although we are 14th on Instagram, we're the first brand in the world to reach 100 million. No other brand. Those are all individuals that are ahead of us. The Kardashians, for instance. Gonna catch those Kardashians. And then just this last week, National Geographic won an Oscar for our documentary Free Solo. And thank you.
Very good. See it.
We're poised to have Disney as our new partnership as that transaction closes. They're buying Fox, and that'll happen in the next week or two. Super excited about that. But I guess, what I think is really cool about this quote-unquote legacy organization is, we have a fearless board that is willing to, we always are looking and peeking around corners at what's next, totally willing to disrupt ourselves. And one of the messages of the book is, look, we live in a time of dramatic change. And if you're not having a conversation, too many boards spend time on risk mitigation, the audit committee, the whatever. If you're not talking about the risks you need to be taking to secure yourselves in the future, you're not bringing it as a board. And I tell some cautionary tales. Digital photography was invented at Kodak, who had an 80% market share on traditional film And I can only imagine that room when the engineers walked in and said, oh, we have this way of doing photographs now without film. Can you imagine being on the board?
Didn't go over.
But they didn't embrace it,
Right.
and of course, it wasn't that many years ago that they went into Chapter 11.
So one could say National Geographic is actually in the business of taking us out of our bubble.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
that's what they do,
I think
which
that's
is why
been in
they're
our DNA.
important.
We've tried to bring, we call it the front lines of the unknown that we bring to everybody. We touch nearly 1 billion people a month now because of this expanded venture that we have. And yeah, the whole idea is we try to bring the world that you don't know, and that includes people and cultures and places.
It's amazing. Let's go to the audience for questions. Questions from the audience. We have one here, wherever you have a mic. Finding their way.
Thank you. So Jean, you mentioned the concept of inclusive entrepreneurship, but as you described, there's so many corporations that could be doing more, but those corporations are made up of individuals. How do you really help individuals accelerate their ability and willingness to be fearless so that we can see the same type of progress in corporate America?
Well, one of the things we're backing is a number of incubators and accelerators around the nation that are emerging that are specifically focused on developing the next class of inclusive entrepreneurs. And that ranges, I mean, that really is a focus that ranges between a digital platform called Alice, which is specifically focused on women and people of color, to something called Digital Undivided out of Atlanta, which is a really serious accelerator where you go in for 3 months, and they're really trying to help these young entrepreneurs, and in some cases not young at all, develop their stories, get them investment ready. In many cases, some of these accelerators are bringing with it a fund, so there's opportunity for investment. When I was in Ohio, there's something called Jumpstart, which is very much focused on inclusive entrepreneurship and brings tax benefits for investments into those categories of businesses. So, we see a range of things out there, and we're trying to be supportive in a broad way.
Yes, first I want to congratulate you on your many successes and failures.
Thank you. Although we didn't spend a lot of time talking about my failures, I usually do.
But the failures, you're learning from your failures, so that's great. My question has something to do with your travels. What is something uniquely your own that you've learned from going into these diverse communities when you're traveling in the RV that you just never imagined you'd discover?
Yeah. So I think what I would say is an understanding that, and a broader perspective on an issue. That, and I always get this wrong, is it where you sit determines where you stand, or where you stand comes from where you sit? But that's so true, that without realizing it, you can look at something because that's been your experience. And so if you travel out to places where people are, or even just have a table or, conference room, people who bring different perspectives, I get a much broader perspective, and more importantly, it covers my blind spots, which is a good thing. And we didn't get into it, Mellody, but I personally believe if Silicon Valley were more diverse with different perspectives today, and not pretty much all the elites from the same schools and the same generation mostly driving things, they wouldn't be in the place they are today, because they would have had people covering their blind spots. There's a famous book out right now, I shouldn't say famous, but a new book out about Facebook and the issues they've had. And in it, the author who we know was an early investor in Facebook, said, we had no idea there was this underbelly that could emerge from tech. Steve and I were dealing with that underbelly like in the 80s, okay? Like that is not right. And if you didn't know, then you didn't have the right people around your table. It's just another reach beyond your bubble important moment.
We say this next iteration of tech is going to be a time of humanity and ethics.
I believe
How do you
that.
think that will happen?
Well, I think a couple of things are happening. I think realms haven't been disrupted with innovation that are just, sitting there waiting. And I'll give you an example. I obviously was raised by a single mom in this working class neighborhood. Boy, we would have loved the sharing economy in our world. But when we introduced a sharing economy here in the United States, it became a lot more convenience and choice and control for people who already had a lot of convenience, choice, and control. If we actually start backing these entrepreneurs also from different economic sectors, the kind of innovations they will bring forward are different. We saw this, for instance, in Africa. There's a startup called Hello Tractor. Well, in Africa, they have smallhold farmers, so the kind of machinery that works in the United States doesn't really apply. Hello Tractor has a wholly different form factor of a tractor, and it's the sharing economy. So Joe gets it for 3 hours on Saturday morning, and Mary gets it, on Tuesday afternoon. So suddenly now machinery is affordable that can increase the yield, that can help you grow as a farmer. Those kind of things, some of the solutions, I took our Case Foundation team, Steve and I did our senior team across Africa, looking at the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and I'm telling you, the kind of innovations that are being built by Africans for Africans are highly relevant right here in the United States for some of our communities.
That's great. Great example. Question in the back.
Yeah, hi, Jean. Any thoughts on better aligning incentives to promote inclusive diversity? And then how do you measure non-financial returns at the board level on some of these social impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say we're riding a bunch of horses in terms of, I'll take the last part first and then I'll go back to your first question. We're riding a bunch of horses as people try to figure out how they measure social impact. And right now I'd say, there isn't a satisfactory standard that exists out there. For me, that's been okay only because, I think in the early days of a revolution, and I do think impact investing is a bit of a revolution, you want to kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom before you just narrow yourself to one way of looking at things. But TPG has the Y analytics that they're doing. We're backing something called the Impact Management Partnership, where it's a coalition of about 30 organizations trying to build. But we also have some private sector organizations that are looking at bringing some impact measurement as a market opportunity, and I think that has great promise too. So I see a lot of hope. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question? What was that?
Incentives.
Oh, incentives, yeah. So I mentioned Jumpstart in Ohio. If you don't know that, you should take a look at that. That's a great tax incentive program. And many of you may have heard about opportunity zones as well. I believe some of the investments going into opportunity zones will hopefully be inclusive investments. And one of the things some of us engaged in impact investing, and there's a national alliance around that, are doing is having a discussion about if we can seed into communities some pro bono talent that would help inclusive entrepreneurs get investor ready. Because we think there are some good investment opportunities in these opportunity zones. We don't necessarily think they're all investor ready right now. So I think there are opportunity zones, Jumpstart, different ways that you can incentivize investments into these groups.
You say that impact investing is a revolution. Are you a revolutionary?
Yeah, I believe in revolutionary change. And I think that what the book makes clear is, sometimes things happen through an evolutionary way. And by the way, we would say AOL was a 10-year overnight sensation. So when I say revolutionary, I just mean you're really trying to disrupt the status quo and find a new way forward. It often takes longer and it takes more turns than you think it will. So a lot of people are saying, when will impact investing go mainstream? I don't think we're close. I think we're 3 or 5 years. But even if it's 3 or 5 years, that's going to be revolutionary. This idea of looking at capital in a totally different way.
Why do you think you're so comfortable with disruption, which makes so many other people so uncomfortable?
I don't know. Aren't we all products of kind of our experiences in life? And I think, Mellody and I have talked about this. I think sometimes and I say in the book, sometimes the best place you can be is having nothing to lose. Your back's against the wall. This last principle of let urgency conquer fear is my favorite one. And, this fierce urgency of now thing. Because what happens is, if you're not in a good place, if you're agitating in one way or another, anger, frustration, fear, whatever, that often is a great soup to get you out of your comfort zone and push you to do things that you normally would not do. And I've had a lot of uncomfortable places I've lived in my upbringing. But I learned that that's okay because you can push through them and get to the other side. And so I have no doubt that probably played some role. I think the trickiest thing is, like all of us in this room, when you get into a really comfortable place, putting all that at risk, right? Because nothing great really comes from the comfort zone. It takes getting a little uncomfortable in ways, some of which we've talked about in this talk. And that's still hard for me, right? Because you always worry, like, you worry about upending what you have. But if you come into it with a mindset and, you know, really focused on the big bet, I think you let that urgency drive you.
I love the story that you tell where you said you were attempting to do something physical, I think run, and the person you were working with told you spend most of your time doing things you're good at.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And you don't choose to do things that you're not good at.
Right. It was a real revolutionary moment for me, to use that term again. We were doing kind of an outward bound type exercise, and I had to climb a telephone pole. I was belayed, and stand at the top of that pole and then walk across one laying on its side. And I froze, Mellody, as I wrote about in the book, and I didn't think I could do it, and I got like teary, and my voice started to crack, and I was with a team of about 4 or 5 on the ground, and they were all looking up waiting for me to do it. And I yelled down to the guide, I just don't think I can do this, and I was kind of crying. And she said, okay, Jean, okay, you could come down the pole, or you could try. It's like, okay, I know which side of that deal I want to be on. So of course I walked across the pole, came back and came down, and you know, later she said, it's exactly what Mellody said, do you think you've mostly been taking on things that you know you'll be good at? And I had never thought about that.
That was brilliant.
And when I evaluated my life, I had. So she said, how about making a list of things you think you could never do, ever, and just trying them? What's the harm? So I did, and one of them was martial arts, and I became a black belt in Taekwondo. And I was in my 40s at the time, because to me, that was something I could never see myself doing. Like, I just never believed I would have the physical capability to do that. But like everything, you chunk it down, and you can do anything.
Any questions? We have one here.
Yes, thank
Stephanie.
you very much for your wonderful comments. I am an educator. I have been an educator for over 50 years.
Wow.
You talked about the bubble of belief. We are living in the bubble of schooling, and the kinds of minds and habits of mind that you are describing are not part of the bubble of schooling. So if we are really serious about developing innovative minds and inclusion and diversity and taking risks and failing, those are totally antithetical to the current culture of schooling. So when you talk about disruption, education is primed for disruption. When you talk about revolution or transformation, so I'm just curious if in your travels you have sensed that there is something fun. The biggest bet, you said a big bet, is on America's education and America's children. So I'd love to know what you're picking up in your travels about how we can move from places called schools to every school being a center for inquiry and imagination and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for what you do, because I think it's a highly noble profession. So I would go to New Orleans as an example of this. Steve and I spent time down there. You know, right after Katrina, it was really clear that the school systems had been wiped out and a lot of people were moved to other cities. So as they tried to bring the school system back online, Teach for America did a big partnership with them and took 1,000 Teach for America students down there. And it was transformative in many ways, but here's one of the things that came out of it. Those young people who spent time in classrooms, often working with a master teacher too, as you know they do in Teach for America, saw challenges and opportunities and that problem that you just cited and said, this is completely unacceptable. And several of them started companies to try to bring a new way forward with education. Look, what we call ed tech is one of the most exciting new fields, which is truly looking at new models for education that are much needed. I think it's really important. We're excited by the potential that we see there. Unclear to me, some of the new areas that will be disrupted, like ag tech and ed tech and things like that. might not be best served in Silicon Valley. They might be better served in other places, and we see New Orleans has, for instance, a strong lead in this area. So it's much needed. But I'll give you an example of another. We're sitting in Illinois. You don't have to drive very far before you see cornfields and big farms. I write about a guy in the book who was in Kansas, and when he went to Kansas State, he got exposed to this idea of no-till farming. So, our planet is a little bit in a crisis right now, and there's some science to suggest that the release of carbon is really putting us at risk. So this guy had none of that interest. It wasn't like he was, a save the planet kind of guy. He was a farmer. But he learned about no-till farming. And no-till farming simply doesn't till the land. Now, why would that matter? Because when you till the land, you are totally disrupting the ecosystem that exists in that ground, but more importantly, you're exposing carbon dramatically as you disturb the soil. So he started with just a small plot on his huge family farm, thousands and thousands of acres, and found that the yields were better, found that he was preserving the soils, which happens to be among the most important assets on our planet is soil, if you don't know that. And so that's another example of just a farmer who tried a new way forward and now is leading an effort, around the United States to get other farmers to do the same thing. So sometimes just asking the question, what are the opportunities? How could we innovate here? Farming for 100 years did it the same way. And you can imagine when he said, how about we try something new? He wasn't exactly embraced. But there is a large movement going across America to preserve our soils and not just send carbon into the air that could play a really significant role.
I don't know if this is possible as an ending thought, but we're out of time. But I have this lingering question. You are seeking, you're learning, you are doing. If you were to look back and say, if I could define this life of mine in a few words, what do you want yours to stand for?
An explorer.
My friend the explorer, the revolutionary, Jean Pitts.